Hey everyone, welcome to SC Modding episode 7. Today I'm going to take you through how to modify a case side panel window. This video is a continuation of SC Modding episode 6, in which I started to modify an NZXT H440. And this video is also part of a series of case modding videos I'm going to be doing, starting with the basics and working my way up. This build is SingularityComputers Client Build 21, and the case, as I mentioned, is the NZXT H440, and it's the Razor edition. Now there's two things that I want to change about this side panel window. First of all, the size. And a side panel window mod is a very common mod. This is a video that I've had a lot of requests for. I'm installing a radiator and fans into the front here, and onto that radiator with SingularityComputers ethereal reservoir mounts, I'm going to be mounting a pump and reservoir configuration with a large tube reservoir. And I want that to be the main feature of the build, so obviously it needs to be fully visible, and I also want the water cooling loop, the whole loop, to be fully visible. So this side panel window needs to be expanded. I also don't like smoked side panel windows because you can't see the components properly. The only reason you can see them now is because I'm shining bright light onto the case, but in normal light you can't even see the components. And so I'm going to change this side panel window from smoked acrylic to clear acrylic. Let's start with the tools and materials you are going to need for this mod. I'm going to put links in the video description to all of this. First of all, you're going to need a 1 meter ruler, and these stainless steel rulers are best. I also like to use a smaller ruler at 30 centimeters. For marking out the measurements, you can just use a ballpoint pen, because what I do is mask everything up, which really helps with marking out the measurements, and it also protects the paint job, although that's not really going to matter for this mod because we are going to be repainting the side panel anyway, because we are cutting into it after all. The tape that I use for masking up is always 3M painter's tape. This tape is absolutely awesome. Now for cutting the side panel, there's a whole lot of cutting tools that you can use. Use whatever you want. You can use angle grinders or even air tools, but what I like to use is a jigsaw and a Dremel. I usually use both for a mod like this. You're also going to need a drill and a set of drill bits. I like to use M4 for attaching side panel windows. There is actually a way around this, an alternative where you don't have to drill holes at all, and I'll show you this shortly. You're also going to need some paint, so I have here a primer and a satin black paint. This is actually not the paint I'm going to be using. I'm going to be using a spray gun, but this will certainly do the job. Spray cans will definitely do a good job if you are careful. I also have some methylated spirits here because on the inside of this side panel is some sound dampening foam, and this is going to be attached with a very strong adhesive, so it's going to be hard to remove. So rubbing alcohol, methylated spirits, there's a lot of different things you can use to remove adhesive, but the metho is what I'm going to be using in combination with a razor blade. And once I have removed the bulk of it, I'll sand off the rest, because we're also going to be sanding the side panel as surface preparation ready for painting. So I have here a sanding block, and I have 400 and 600 grit sandpaper. I'll probably also use 800 grit sandpaper, so I'll add that to the list. Now you're also going to need some 3mm acrylic. So this is transparent acrylic, and you're going to need some bolts to mount to the window, and these are M4 bolts. They're 8mm long, and they're button head Allen key bolts, zinc plated, so they're black. And you can pick these up from the SingularityComputers store. These are actually fairly hard to find, mainly without printing on the top. You can see there's nothing printed on these bolts. They're very clean looking. Also some washers and nuts. So the alternative to that, though, if you don't want to bolt on the side panel window, is to tape it on. Now I always bolt on my side panel windows. I prefer the look of it. It's higher quality, but a lot of people use double-sided tape, and this is the best double-sided tape to use by far. It's 3M, and it's transparent, so it doesn't go white or yellow or anything like that, so you can hardly see it. So that also works really well, but I do recommend bolting it on. The first thing I'm going to do to the side panel is remove the stock side panel window. And with this one, all you need to do is bend up these tabs. Ideally, you should use a flathead screwdriver, but the ruler is working fine for me. They are a little bit hard to get to with your fingers, but you know, sometimes you can just bend them up by hand. It doesn't matter if they get scratched or if they break off, because we're actually going to cut these out anyway. Now that that's out, I'm going to remove the sound dampening foam. So the sound dampening foam was definitely a little difficult to remove, and I knew it would be because of the adhesives that they usually use for this kind of thing. But definitely the best way to do it is to soak it in methylated spirits, rubbing alcohol, anything like that, and then get stuck into it with a paint scraper. The razor blade, just too sharp, digs into the paint job too much, too small and hard to hold. You can get a lot more pressure onto the surface with a paint scraper, so that's the way to go. So you can see there's still a fair bit of adhesive on the surface here, but I'm not going to get that yet because I still need to do sanding and surface preparation anyway, so I'll get it then. And I'm about to make a lot more of a mess of this panel because I'm about to start cutting into it. And before I can start cutting, the next step is obviously to measure out. Before you can start cutting, and this is actually something you really should do at the beginning of the mod, is take a look at the inside of the side panel and make sure that there's nothing that is in your way. Because sometimes the way the side panel attaches to the case is right where you're going to be cutting, which means the mod is not going to be possible, or you're going to have to adjust your measurements to allow for it. But you can see with this side panel, there's plenty of room. We're definitely going to be able to do it, so it's time to start measuring up. I've masked up the entire panel because you need to mask up wherever you're going to be marking out measurements and cutting. Now this panel is not symmetrical like I thought. It turns out that the top and bottom are actually smaller than the side. And what I've done with my measurements is I've taken off roughly 3 millimeters all the way around. And what I've ended up with is 40 millimeters on either side, because I've copied the measurement from one side to the other here to keep it symmetrical, and 33 millimeters on the top and bottom. So a little bit smaller on the top and bottom than either side. So I've copied the stock measurements, but minus roughly 3 millimeters all the way around. And the reason for that is I obviously need to cut off this folded section from where the stock side panel fits and all of these tabs. But at the same time, I don't want to cut off too much because I need to keep enough side panel behind to mount my window onto. Something else you need to consider is how you want to do the corners, if you want them rounded or square. I usually go for a very small circle. You can see what I've used here is a Dremel attachment, nice and small for a nice sharp rounded corner. So I've finished cutting. Now it's time to clean it up with the file. And I like to do this part of it without the tape so that I can see exactly what I'm doing, because I mostly do this by eye. Just grab the ruler and check your lines like this. Where the high spots are, just keep filing, and also, keep checking your measurements as you go to make sure you're not on any big angles. And for the corners, you're going to obviously need a rounded file, but it turns out this small rounded file I have is not even small enough to get those corners, so I'm going to need to grab something even smaller for that. I've finished filing, so all of the cuts are nice and straight now. The next step now is to drill the mounting holes for the side panel window. And all you really need to take into consideration for this is the size of your bolt head, because you don't want your bolt head overhanging the edge of the panel. And you want to place them in about at least 5 millimeters from the edge, but it doesn't really matter as long as it's something that you think looks balanced and there's also nothing in the way on the back of the side panel that's going to interfere with the holes. So I've marked out the holes and I'm now going to drill them. I'm using a 4.5 millimeter drill bit because I'm planning on using M4 bolts. It's now time for surface preparation. And I'm starting with 600 grit, which I'm going to use all over the panel. and then I'll move on to 800 grit. But I also am going to use 400 grit on the edges, on the cuts where I've been filing, and also probably on the holes, you know, wherever it's really, really rough. But I'm going to try to get all of it with the 600. I've finished sanding, and some important things to remember when you are sanding is, first of all, sand the entire surface. Don't miss anything, because the sanding will not only help with paint adhesion, but it will also give you a far better surface to paint onto if you get it nice and flat, because you might be dealing with a powder coat which has a kind of bumpy satin finish, or there might be orange peel on the factory paint job like there was on this one. And you can see the slight textured surface. That's actually the high spots on the orange peel that I've sanded off. So this factory paint job wasn't completely flat, and that's something you'll come across a lot. So it's far better to have a nice flat surface. And I started with 400 grit, and then 600, and then 800. Now that I've finished sanding, the next step is to clean up the panel ready for paint. And the first thing I do is to wash it in soapy water. Now, make sure you wash the entire surface, because you're trying to get rid of any oils on the surface, specifically from your hands from handling it. And when you start washing, you need to put gloves on. And so as soon as I start the cleanup process, I start wearing gloves, and after that I don't touch it again with bare hands. Once I've washed it, I wait for it to dry, and then I wipe it down with methylated spirits. And for this, I just use a good microfiber cloth, and I hang it up where I'm actually going to paint it before I start cleaning it up with the metho. So you can see I've finished priming the panel, and it's now 24 hours later, and it does take that long for the primer that I'm using to dry. So the primer I've used is a DNA primer, and the base coat I'm using is a DuPont Gloss Black. The final step of surface preparation before you start painting is to remove the particles off the surface. I mean, you have dust constantly landing on the surface, and a lot of people use a tack cloth for this, but I much prefer to use high pressure air. At least 80 psi, I find it's a lot more effective. I'm not going to cover painting at all in this video, because I am going to cover it in a future SC modding video. I've completed the custom paint job on the side panel, and the final step of this mod is to cut out and install the acrylic side panel window. So you can see that I've already cut out the window and drilled the holes, and it's now ready for installation. The first thing you need to do to measure it out is to take a look at the inside of your side panel and the overhang that it is going to allow for. Now, if you have no room for overhang, there is another option which I'm going to talk about, but you can see that we have good overhang here, and the minimum that you need to have is 5 millimeters. And the maximum you need is certainly no more than 15 millimeters. But we have 10 at the top and bottom, 40 at the back, and 20 at the front. The next thing you need to do once you cut out your side panel window is mark out the holes. And you need to clamp the side panel window in position while you're marking out the holes, because you need to do it very, very accurately. Okay, I'm drilling the holes, and you can easily do this with a hand drill. I'm doing it on a drill press because, well, it's easier and you can get a better result, because the thing about drilling acrylic, particularly close to the edge, is it's very easy to split it, to crack it, if you go too quickly. And that's where a drill press really helps out, because it gives you a lot of extra accuracy and you can take your time with it. Once you've drilled all of the holes, the last step is to test fit the side panel window. Make sure that you install all of the bolts and tighten them all the way so that you can make sure that everything lines up. And this step is just in case you need to make any final adjustments to the acrylic. After I cut out the panel, the edges were quite clean because I used a fine-tooth blade on the jigsaw. So I then moved on to filing the edges to get them straight with a fine file. After that, I moved on to sandpaper on a sanding block. And the good thing about using it on a sanding block is that you can get the edges nice and straight. 400, 600, 800, 1200, 1500, 2000, and now this is 2500 grit. Now you don't have to be this fussy. A lot of people will just cut the side panel window and install it. But if you want edges which look the same as the face, a perfect mirror finish, and this is something I always do for my side panel windows, I have for a long time, polish them to a mirror finish. It really doesn't take that long. So now on my final grit, and after this I'll move on to the polishing step. Now once you've gone through all of the sandpaper grits I mentioned, back to 2500, it's going to look pretty much perfect unless you look at it under a microscope. But if you're fussy enough to have taken it this far, you probably want to go all the way. So you can do this step by hand, a bit of plastic polish or a cutting compound or polish design for paint. Just a bit of it on a microfiber cloth and just rub the edges. You don't really need to spend that much time. Acrylic is fairly easy to polish, definitely a lot easier than paint. But if you do want a better result faster, and you have the tools, 2500 RPM rotary tool, any type of sponge from coarse to medium is good for this. Put the polish on the sponge always, otherwise you're going to end up with a bit of a mess. To improve the aesthetics and the strength of this side panel window mod, I've beveled the edges of the acrylic at the top and bottom. And I've done this because of the angled sections at the top and bottom of this side panel. So this is going to literally allow the acrylic to key into the side panel, making it a lot cleaner and giving it a lot more strength. And a number of side panels are designed this way, which means you can actually often do this. I'm doing the final assembly, and there is nothing that will drive your OCD to the edge more than a high gloss black paint job. We all know what gloss surfaces are like for fingerprints. Acrylic is terrible, it's very difficult to keep clean, and you only have to touch it to scratch it. Well, a high gloss black paint job, if anything lands on the surface that is not black, which is pretty much going to be everything, specks of dust, whatever it might be, you can see it so easily. Little imperfections in the paint job and the clear coat. You can't get away with anything with a high gloss black paint job. Everything from the ground up has to be absolutely spot on. And so I recommend against gloss black for beginner painters. I suggest you stick with satin because you can get away with a lot with a satin finish. And that's the very reason that a lot of car manufacturers will actually lay a large orange peel into their paint jobs to hide the imperfections. So you can see how crazy this paint job is driving me, and the acrylic is pretty similar. But if you're careful, you keep the area clean where you're working, and I suggest you do this for the sake of the acrylic, because once you start touching acrylic and getting it dirty and then cleaning it, well, cleaning it scratches it. And then the only way to really fix the scratches and clean it up properly is by polishing it. And I have actually done an acrylic polishing guide recently, so I'll put a link on the screen to that video. There's a lot of things you can do with a side panel window, and some of the other options that you have, you can actually mount the acrylic on the outside of the panel and bevel the edges. That's something I've done in the past. It looks amazing, and it's a great way of getting around problems with attaching it on the inside of the side panel if that's not possible, because sometimes there's just too many things in the way. The mod is now complete and it looks great on the case. I'm very happy with the way it's turned out, and you can see that the black that I've used is a pure black, jet black or midnight black, whereas the black on the case is actually more of a anthracite or a coal color, charcoal, and so it's not a full black. So this paint job doesn't actually match, but it does match the plastic parts on the case and a lot of the internal components, and the finish also matches the plastic parts. So I prefer it this way, and I like the way that it's turned out. It's nice to have something a little bit different, a few different shades of black, different finishes. help to increase the detail of a build. So that sums up this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember that none of this would be possible without our patrons. Thank you for watching.